Hey there everyone, it's Silver. This is Warhammer 40,000 Battlesector. Yeah, I was finally able to go back and take a look at this. It's been a couple years since its release, and I've seen it multiple times on my Steam queues and things, and I've always been interested in actually going back and looking at it. I've just never had the chance. So here we are finally, a better time than ever, given that it's basically the anniversary for the game, and it's got some really significant DLC content in the form of the new Orcs pack. So what the heck is it? Well, it's a turn-based strategy game, but it is not in the kind of like XCOM style exactly, because although there are some characters where you control a single one, most of the time you're controlling a squad of characters. So every unit that you can actually control is generally constructed of multiple models, as the game calls them, more than one character per unit that you control. And in this case, the main campaign is focused on the Blood Angels. The Blood Angels are a very flawed chapter of the Space Marines, which are the only ones that I tend to like, personally. I don't really enjoy the usual Space Marine story of making them just tremendously better than humanity in every way. I think that's boring. So I like chapters like the Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, chapters that are all about like showing how flawed they are and the fact that they're not actually any better than humanity. They're just different. So I definitely approve of the choice of Space Marine chapter on display here, and it is a pretty challenging game, I would say. Part of the challenge is probably because I'm just not very good at it yet, but I think the rest of the challenge is because a lot of this has to do with swarm defense and things, because in the campaign your main antagonists are the Tyranids, and the rule with the Tyranids is there are always more. Whenever you think you've beaten them all, whenever you think you've finally gotten the last squad of them, there's more. There's always more. And this game has actually received a lot of really sizable updates over time, so there are more modes than just the campaign and multiplayer skirmish. There's also the demonic incursion mode and this sort of big conquest thing. There's a lot going on here, but right now I'm just talking about the campaign because it's the first thing that I played. And the way it works is it is, of course, a linear mission-based campaign where you go from mission to mission, and each mission will have a point value, and you can build an army based on the units that you have unlocked so far up to that point value. So every different unit is, of course, worth a different number of points, and you can combine them in whatever ways you wish to get up to that value as close as you can so that you can have your own custom force. Do you want an army made entirely of Space Marines with jetpacks and big chainswords? You can do that. Do you want just plasma weapons for days and only plasma weapons? You can do that too. So there's definitely a good amount of like tactical variety, I would say, because there's a lot of units in this game. All of the factions have a lot of units to choose from, actually. You've also got more like hero-style units, actual named characters that you only control one of rather than a squad. These are free. They cost 0 points in the campaign, but they also fail you if you let them die. So there's a bit of a double-edged sword there. You know, you can have them for free, but if they ever die in battle, then you lose on the spot. But these hero units are also important in the campaign because there's a skill tree system. Every hero has their own skill tree, and you get these skill points from actually completing missions. Every mission will award you with a certain number, but also during the mission, oftentimes some optional objectives will pop up, and if you're able to complete those and still live, then you will get even more points for the skill trees afterwards, so they're very much worth doing if you can. And these skill trees are pretty cool because they don't only affect that hero unit, they will give that unit like different weapon choices or different activatable skills they can use in battle for like buffing their armies and things like that, but they also affect other units under their command. So you might have a hero that gives the aggressor units a specific new activatable ability that allows them to sort of dig in place and fire out huge volleys of gauntlet fire. Or maybe another hero can replace your assault troops, the jetpack chainsword guys. They have bolt pistols normally, but they can be replaced with something like a hand flamer instead, making them like extra good anti-swarm units. So I think personally this is actually a really good idea for a campaign, having just increasingly complex and difficult missions against Tyranids while having a force that is based kind of like the tabletop on a certain number of points that you can actually deploy at once, and then giving the ability to improve the various units with all these skill trees and stuff, making your points even more valuable because they still cost the same number of points to deploy, but now they have some extra abilities or some higher stats or something like that that makes them even more valuable, and just making yourself stronger over time. In battle, the controls are nice and simple, but it is still a very tactical game. You simply move with movement points and use actions with action points. It is exactly as simple as it sounds, but there are a lot of different choices to make when you're actually using these points because you don't want to get eaten by what looks like a giant dog with scythes for arms. So you got to be a bit smart about where you're moving and where you're firing from. Every unit has at least one equipped weapon, and these weapons have preferred ranges. They have a sort of total range, and maybe they can hit anywhere from 2 to 6 squares away, but they also have a preferred range, and this will show as the sort of golden reticle symbols that surround a unit when you have them selected. That shows you what their currently equipped weapon's preferred range is, and if you're able to get them within that range and get one of the enemies on one of those highlighted squares, then they will have more damage and more accuracy at that exact range. That's their sort of perfect range they need to be at to be as effective as possible. So the game board almost looks like chess sometimes, because it's not just about, moving your dudes forward and having them just shoot everything in sight. It's about moving people in specific strategic positions to make sure they can actually target the group you want them to target at the optimal range for their equipped weapons, and making sure they're not in the way of anyone else, because units can move through each other, but it takes a bunch of movement points for them to do so. So you have to be careful about how you're positioning people and make sure you're not creating your own choke point to get yourself killed from behind or whatever, because you're not allowing your units to move as freely as they should. You're crowding them together or stopping up choke points and things. And of course, you've also got to consider what you're fighting against, because Tyranids have all sorts of colorful things they can throw at you, from stuff like the Venom Thropes, which do a deceptively massive amount of damage in melee, but can also provide this sort of AoE poison effect that just amplifies the damage everyone around takes, to, of course, your traditional Tyranid warriors of various equipment types that are just nasty to deal with because they have a large amount of health in comparison to some of the more swarmy units and can deal out a lot of damage. And then you've got some really scary stuff like the Tyrannifexes and those giant exocrine cannon thingies that are basically just like living artillery. They're a huge problem because they can actually attack you with very high damage attacks from a range that you can't see them. So they're really hard to deal with. Sometimes you got to be careful about them. That's when stuff like jetpack equipped troops come in handy, because they can cross a large amount of land very quickly and sort of crowd around big units like that and take them down with high armor piercing chainswords and things. That's another thing to talk about, by the way, is there's also armor. Every unit has an armor value and every weapon has an armor piercing value, and that will determine how much of its damage actually gets through. So this is why you need people equipped with stuff like melt-a-guns, plasma weapons, crack grenades, things like that have super high armor piercing, because you may come across something that's got very high armor and your normal bolters and things are just going to bounce off of it. If something has enough armor, it can actually outright take no damage from your attacks at all. Sometimes they'll take a little bit, but it'll just say resisted instead of a damage number to let you know that you're just not getting through and this is not working. But that is, of course, just the campaign. There's also all the other modes to look at, and this is where the DLC comes in. This game has several DLC packs you can get for different factions, and these are well worth it because they are actually full-on faction DLC. It's not just a couple of units, it's like a whole army, and you can use these factions in skirmishes and multiplayer and all that stuff and actually play as them. So the main three that you've got are my favorite, the Necrons. You've also got the Orcs, the newest one, and the Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Sororitas, which has a whole bunch of pretty cool stuff, including big tanks that are also missile launchers that are also pipe organs. And the most fun I've had in this game so far has been in the skirmish mode, just trying out various armies against various AI armies and seeing what happens, because these other factions are so fun to play as. In skirmish, you can play as the complete set, the ones I just described as DLC, as well as, of course, the Blood Angels and the Tyranids themselves. And you have a couple of preset armies that are built for you, that just to help you sort of get into the game and see what can be built, but you also have a custom army builder, and you can build various armies of various different point values and then use them in skirmishes or the other modes, so that you have a whole list of custom armies you've made that you can deploy whenever you want, and you can even fight against your own custom armies if you want to. If you want to fight specifically against Tyranids, but you want to fight them in a really certain way on a certain map, then you can create your own Tyranid army to fight against if you want, or if you want things as random as possible, you can have the game completely randomly construct an army of a certain point value and then have you fight against that so you don't know what to expect. There's a lot of love here in the modes that shows that they have really taken into consideration what people want from a game like this and offered a lot of different ways to get it, which I think is really cool. These skirmishes themselves are very fun, and they have all sorts of different maps that you can play on, as well as different types of objectives, because you can just do the simple Exterminatus objective, which is just kill everyone, but you've also got your more control point based stuff and other things of that nature. And then of course you've got the other modes I haven't even mentioned, like the demonic incursion mode and the big big planetary conquest mode as well. And there's definitely also a lot of love here in terms of the lore accuracy of the way the units work. There's the people clearly love 40K because if you just zoom in and look at the units and the way they move and the way they fire and everything, it's pretty cool. There's a lot of detail in them, and it reminds me of how I imagine like a tabletop war would look, you know, like whenever you're playing Warhammer on the tabletop and you're sort of imagining what everything looks like, this kind of comes to mind as a really good representation of that. The soundscape in particular, I would say, is very good. All of the unit sounds have just a really nice atmospheric effect to them, like, you know, Space Marines stomp around, Tyranids slither and crawl and skitter. There's a lot of, like, movement noises for all the units that sound really good, but there's also a lot of really good weapon noises and things. Bolters sound like bolters. They sound very powerful. Plasma weapons are your pew-pew sticks with some pretty nice sound effects on impact that sound very nasty, that you wouldn't want to be standing there. And, of course, like, melta weapons and stuff sound very exotic and strange, like they should. And the other factions also play in a really fun way. So the Adeptus Sororitas plays like kind of you would expect if you know anything about them. They play in a really odd way with a mixture of kind of squishy melee units that are really, really fast and have some nasty stuff up close, as well as like big tanks and armored units behind kind of supporting things from afar. So you've got an army of kind of unorthodox units with odd weapon ranges and stuff that sort of synergize well with each other and are very mobile in general and can really get around the battlefield quickly and attack from good ranges and stuff. And then you've got the orcs, which are just all over the place, exactly like orcs should be, because you've got big swarm units like the Gretchen, of course, that can just sort of crawl all over everything and beat it to a pulp. And then you've got like your weird boys with all their crazy powers and like your big mechs and stuff and your death copters and all that. So there's a lot of like vehicle-based gameplay and stuff for the orcs, and they have a lot of really good sounding weapons, really beefy cannons and stuff that sound excellent. And they're just a really flexible force because that's what orcs are supposed to be, right? They have a bit of everything. They just kind of slap whatever they want together and see what happens. And their force very much feels like something that has been very badly welded together and still works somehow. And all of their stuff is like just weird and has odd ranges and doesn't look like it should function at all. And that's exactly what I would want from an orc army. And then you've got the Necrons, which work exactly like how I would want them to. They are slow, kind of implaceable, and they have oddly long ranges with very powerful weapons, and you don't want to get close to them at all. They've also got some nasty vehicles that they can deal with, and they have some deceptively long ranges on some of those vehicle weapons as well, so you might expect like a sort of almost main battle tank like Gauss cannon to not shoot that far, but it does shoot that far, and you really need to stay away from it. And also they can of course reanimate. I like the fact that all of the bodies in a battle actually stay there for the whole battle, so as you're clearing like massive hordes of Tyranids, then you see like all this blood and all these Tyranid bodies just collecting over the course of the battle, so that by the end of the battle everything is just like stained in liquid Tyranid all over the place. But I like the fact that even though this is really cool, Necrons don't do it, because they're not supposed to. When a Necron goes down, they either reanimate or their body teleports away, and that's exactly what happens in this game. If a Necron gets killed, then sometimes they stand back up and sometimes they teleport out in a green flash, but otherwise they do not leave any bodies behind. So I think there's a lot of pretty cool detail when it comes to the way the sort of battle scarring works and the way that everything looks after the battle is mostly done and how much horrible death is everywhere. So this is a really solid turn-based strategy game, and any fan of 40K would definitely do themselves a favor to try it out, because it's one of those games that has really substantial DLC that's worth having, rather than like nickel and diming DLC that is filled with stuff you don't really need, like little bits of stuff. The content here is actually very substantial and is worth the money. And I would say the game in general is also worth the money. It is a substantial game with a lot of modes and a lot of fun to be had. And if you don't care about anything I've just said and you're just in it for multiplayer because you see a turn-based strategy and you want to beat other people up in it, then you can do that. This game does have an active multiplayer scene. You can play all these factions in multiplayer on all the maps with all the objectives and all that stuff. So yeah, if you do only care about like PvP, this game does do that just as well as it does everything else, in my opinion. So I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Battlesector, so that you can go and check it out yourself on your own time, celebrate the anniversary by murdering some Tyranids and getting molecularly pulled apart by some spooky green pharaoh skeletons. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.